For 6 long years, Wyatt Brennan hadn't held a woman, not since the war took everything from him. So when the widow collapsed against his chest, a bullet having just grazed her skin, he was shocked by 2 things. The first was how his arms remembered exactly what to do. The second was her whisper, "Don't let me die alone." He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He only knew that the most powerful man in town had his hand wrapped around her throat, and nobody was going to stop him. "I own this town," Shaw warned. "The bank, the law, everything." But Wyatt stepped forward anyway. What he didn't know was that saving this woman would cost him everything he had left. That Shaw would hunt them both with guns, fire, and false accusations, and that somewhere between protecting her life and nearly losing his own, he would finally find a reason to stop running. This story proves that sometimes the moment you stop running from your past is the moment your future finally begins. And the people worth fighting for? They're often found in the most unexpected places. If you believe that broken people can still find their way to love, drop a comment below. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for a second chance. And subscribe. Because stories like this remind us what courage really looks like. For 6 long years, Wyatt hadn't held a woman, not since the war took his beloved. So when the widow fell against him, a bullet having just grazed her skin, he was shocked by 2 things. The first was how his arms knew just what to do. The second was her whisper, "Don't let me die alone." He'd been riding for 3 days straight across the panhandle with only warm water and a whole lot of silence for company. His horse, Mercy, had gone lame, forcing him to walk the last 5 miles. The town of Dusty Springs looked like a mirage in the heat, just a few tired buildings huddled together against the big empty. He was just trying to get to the general store when he heard it. Glass shattered, followed by a woman's scream. Then a man's voice, thick and mean with whiskey, boomed out. "You're going to sign it, Clara, one way or another." Wyatt told himself to keep walking. It was not his business. He was just passing through. But his feet had other ideas, and his hand found the familiar comfort of the Colt at his hip. The boarding house door was busted open. Inside, a parlor was in shambles. A woman was pinned to the wall, a big man's hand wrapped tight around her throat. But she was a fighter. She wasn't crying or begging. She was clawing at his face, drawing blood and kicking his shins hard enough to make the big man grunt in pain. "You little spitfire," the man snarled. He was large, with the soft middle of a man who pays others to do his hard work. His fancy clothes, a silk vest and a gold watch, were wildly out of place in this dusty town. "Get your hands off me, Shaw," the woman gasped. "Sign over the deed, and I will," he replied. "I would rather burn this place to the ground," she said through gritted teeth. Shaw just laughed, a nasty sound. "That can be arranged. A tragic fire. A grieving widow dies. I buy the land from the county for next to nothing." He leaned in closer, his voice turning slick. "Or you can sign, take the money I'm offering, and start fresh somewhere new. This was my husband's home. I am not selling. James has been gone 2 years now, Clara. It is time to let it go." "Don't you dare say his name," she choked out. Shaw's hand tightened, and that was when Wyatt decided he'd seen enough. "That's enough!" His voice cut through the room, flat and cold. Both of them turned to see him standing in the doorway, covered in trail dust, his hand resting on his gun. "This is a private matter, stranger," Shaw warned. "Not anymore," Wyatt said. Shaw let the woman go, but squared up to Wyatt, judging him. He saw a tired drifter with a limp. He did not see the coiled readiness in Wyatt's stance, or the cold calm that had settled in his eyes. "You have no idea who I am," Shaw bragged. "I own this town, the bank, the law, everything." "Good for you. Now step away from the lady." Shaw's laugh was shaky now. "You're either brave or a fool, friend." "I ain't your friend." Wyatt said quietly. Shaw moved quick for a big fella, reaching for his pistol. But Wyatt was faster. His Colt was out and cocked in a single smooth motion. The sound of the hammer clicking back was like a crack of thunder in the quiet room. Shaw froze with his gun halfway out of its holster. "Go on," Wyatt invited softly. "Finish the draw." After a long, tense moment, Shaw slowly raised his hand away from his gun. "This is not over," he hissed. "It is for today," Wyatt replied, his own gun still steady. "You will walk out that door, get on your horse, and you will leave this woman be." "And if I do not?" Wyatt gave him a smile that held no warmth. "Then I reckon we'll see who's faster." Shaw glared, then straightened his vest and touched the fresh scratches on his cheek. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Drifter. Add it to the list," Wyatt said. After Shaw left, Wyatt finally holstered his pistol and turned to the woman. She was watching him, her eyes fierce. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Name's Wyatt Brennan. I was just passing through." "Well, Mr. Brennan," she said, steadying herself, "you should have kept on passing." "You heard him," she continued, her voice sharp as she started to right the overturned furniture. "Marcus Shaw owns everyone in this town, including the sheriff. You just painted a target on your own back. For what?" "You did not ask for my help," Wyatt admitted. "Then why did you?" He watched her gather the broken pieces of a vase, her hands shaking just a little. "Because no one else was stopping him," he said simply. She looked up, a flicker of surprise on her face before it vanished. "Thank you," she said formally. "But you need to leave. Now. Before Shaw comes back with his men." Wyatt looked around the wrecked room, at the worn but tidy space, and at the woman who was holding it all together with pure grit. "Seems to me there might be something here worth staying for," he said, almost to himself. "What?" she asked sharply. "You have a room for rent?" he asked instead. "You want to stay after what just happened?" "I want to stay because of what just happened," he answered, setting a chair back on its feet. "Besides, my horse needs the rest." She sighed, a long, weary sound. "Mr. Brennan, staying here will only bring more trouble. Shaw does not forgive." "Then I reckon we ought to be ready for him." She stared at him as if he were crazy. "You do not even know me." "I know you have a right to live in your own home without some bully trying to run you out of it. That is reason enough for me." The air was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Clara gave in. "Rooms are $2 a night," she said, "meals included. And Mr. Brennan, if Marcus Shaw kills you, I am not cleaning up the mess. Paying for the service." A hint of a smile touched Wyatt's lips. He wouldn't dare ask. Her name was Clara Jane Whitmore, and she had more grit than any woman he'd ever known. He learned that over the next few hours when she flatly refused his help tidying up the parlor. "I've been getting by just fine on my own," she said. She turned down his offer to stable the horses on his own dime, declaring, "I don't accept handouts." She also told him 3 times he was a fool for staying. "But since you're set on it, you might as well make yourself useful and fetch some firewood." He learned other things, too. He noticed the boarding house had 6 rooms, but only his and 1 other were taken. The kitchen was run by an Irish woman, Maggie O'Brien, who had a sharp wit and a kind soul. Clara's younger brother Daniel, 17 and simmering with anger, came back as the sun went down. He took one look at the wrecked parlor and turned pale. "What happened here?" "Nothing," Clara said, guiding him toward the kitchen. "Mr. Shaw just paid a visit. We had a little disagreement." "A disagreement?" The boy's voice shook. "There is blood on this floor, Clara." "Shaw's blood," Wyatt spoke up from the doorway. "Your sister put up a heck of a fight before I showed up." Daniel spun around. "Who in the blazes are you?" "Daniel?" Clara's voice cut like a knife. "Watch your tongue." "It is a fair question," Wyatt said, stepping into the room. He moved easy, not wanting to spook the boy. He remembered being 17, old enough to feel like a man, but too young to be one. "Name is Wyatt Brennan. I am a guest. We do not have any guests." "Well, you do now. Daniel's gaze shifted from his sister to Wyatt. Shaw came here himself. With his hand clamped around my throat, Clara stated plainly. This man made him stop. The suspicion in the boy's face softened, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Daniel said, his voice low, for helping her. Do not mention it. No, I mean it, the boy said, standing a little taller. Shaw has been after this land for a year because of the water rights. This place has the only creek around, and he wants to own every last drop. Daniel, Clara warned. He needs to know what he's getting into, the boy insisted. Shaw tried to buy us out 6 months ago, but Clara refused. This was our pa's place, she said. 3 generations of Whitmore women have served food from this kitchen. I am not about to hand it over to some cattle baron. So Shaw started causing problems, Daniel went on. Folks in town won't sell us supplies. The bank is suddenly calling in loans. Last month, our well was poisoned. And the sheriff? Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Tom Decker is in Shaw's pocket. He would arrest his own kin if Shaw told him to. Wyatt took it all in. He knew men like Marcus Shaw. He knew what they did to people who stood in their way. How much do you owe that bank? He asked. Clara's face hardened. That is none of your business. It is if Shaw plans to take this place from you. It is $400, Daniel blurted out. It is due at the end of the month, and we have barely got 50 saved. Clara glared at her brother, but Daniel held his ground. He is just trying to help, Clara. You have been fighting this all by yourself for 2 years since James passed. You keep saying we will be fine, but we are not. I cannot lose you too. You are all I have left. The silence that followed was heavy. Wyatt watched Clara's tough exterior crack for just a second before she fixed it back in place. Go on and wash up for supper, she told her brother gently. Daniel nodded and headed upstairs. $400, Wyatt said into the quiet. I am aware of what I owe. I was not judging, he said. I was just thinking. A woman alone is an easy mark. But a married woman, well, that changes things. Clara let out a short, sharp laugh. Are you asking for my hand, Mr. Brennan? We've only known each other a few hours. I'm not asking for anything. Just thinking out loud. Well, stop it. You are giving me a headache. But he noticed she had not called him crazy. She just told him to quit thinking, which was a different thing entirely. You seem to know your numbers, he said. What is this property really worth? With the water rights, it is worth 3 times that, maybe more, she admitted. So Shaw is trying to steal a place worth nearly $2,000 for a $400 debt. That is the long and short of it. And what if someone else paid that debt? Someone Shaw could not push around. Clara turned to face him, her eyes dark in the dim light. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Brennan? I am suggesting that I have some money put away. Not 400, but close to it. I am also suggesting that I have been wandering for 6 years, looking for something I could not even name. And I am saying that maybe, he trailed off. This was a wild idea. He knew nothing about this woman except that she fought back when a powerful man tried to break her. And when she looked at him, something deep inside him woke up. Maybe what? Clara asked. Nothing. Forget I said a word. You were going to say something about us getting married. I was going to say something foolish. He felt her move closer. Say it anyway. Wyatt took a deep breath. For 6 years, he had been alone, building walls around himself. I was going to say, he finally managed, that I am tired of drifting. That this place, right here, feels like somewhere a man could finally stop. And maybe, he made himself meet her gaze, a woman who fights this hard is a woman worth fighting for. Clara just stared at him for what felt like a lifetime. You are right, she said at last. That is foolish. She turned and walked away, leaving him by the window. But she stopped at the door. Supper is in an hour. Maggie is making stew. Do not you be late. Then she was gone. The trouble began at midnight. The sound of shattering glass jolted Wyatt from a light sleep. He was up in an instant, his pistol in his hand. Men were shouting outside, their voices rough. Come on out, widow. Shaw has business with you. Wyatt slipped into the hall. Daniel was there, holding a rifle that seemed to swallow him whole. "I saw 4 of them, maybe 5, the boy whispered. "Where is your sister?" "Downstairs. Stay here," Wyatt ordered. "Protect Maggie." He moved down the stairs, sticking to the shadows. Through the broken window, he saw men with torches. Clara was standing in the middle of the parlor holding a shotgun. "Do not," Wyatt said quietly from the shadows. "They want you to shoot first. It gives them an excuse. They are tearing down my home. They are just trying to run you off. There is a difference." A lit torch sailed through the window. Wyatt snatched it out of the air and snuffed it out with his coat. "Nice try," he called out. "You will have to do better than that." The men outside went quiet. "Who is that in there?" one yelled. "Name is Brennan. I am a guest, and I would appreciate it if y'all would let a man get some sleep." "The drifter," a familiar voice sneered. It was Shaw. "I was hoping you had moved along. Sorry to disappoint you." "Not at all," Shaw said, stepping into the light with 4 armed men behind him. "This just makes things easier. I was going to give Mrs. Whitmore one last chance. But if she is entertaining a man, well, that just changes everything." Now, does that sound like a fair story? Calling a poor widow an adulteress with her husband hardly in his grave, the town council and the church would have a field day with that kind of talk. Clara gasped, but Wyatt placed a calming hand on her arm. "Is that all you have, Shaw? Just gossip?" Shaw just smiled. "No. This is—" He raised a hand and one of his men fired a rifle. The shot cracked through the night. Wyatt pulled Clara to the floor as the bullet tore through the wall right over them. "That was just a warning," Shaw yelled out. "Next one's for anyone who shows their face." "So, Mrs. Whitmore, I believe we had some business. 4 men, maybe 5. Wyatt's mind was racing. Bad odds. "What do you want, Shaw?" he yelled. "I want the deed to this place, signed and legal. And if she says no, then things get ugly. Shots in the dark, a tragic fire maybe, a real shame." Clara was trembling next to him, but her hands were steady on her shotgun. "I am not giving him my home," she whispered. "What do we do?" Wyatt asked. He looked at her in the flickering torchlight, at the fire in her eyes and the fear she fought to hide. He had to know. "Do you trust me?" "I hardly know you," she said. "That is not what I asked." After a long pause, she whispered, "Yes." Wyatt gave a single nod. "Then you stay down. No matter what you see, stay down." He stood up. "Shaw, I have a different offer. Let the woman and her family go. Send them off somewhere safe, and I will sign anything you want." "Wyatt, no," Clara pleaded. "I will sign a confession," Wyatt continued. "Tell them I caused all the trouble. You get your villain, and the widow keeps her home." Shaw thought it over. "An interesting idea," he finally said, "but I want the property. Then we are done talking." Another shot splintered the door frame just inches from Wyatt's head. "That is 2 warnings," Shaw shouted. "The 3rd one is for keeps, Mrs. Whitmore." In that moment, Wyatt moved. He dove through the broken window, hit the porch in a roll, and came up shooting. His first shot hit the rifleman. His second hit another man in the leg. Then someone slammed into him, and it all turned to chaos. There were fists, the smell of gunpowder, and men shouting. Wyatt fought like he had in the war, dirty and desperate. He felt a bullet burn across his ribs. Where was Shaw? Suddenly, a pistol was pressed to the back of his head. "That is enough, drifter." Wyatt froze, breathing hard. "Drop your gun." He let it fall. "Now turn around, nice and slow." He turned to see Shaw holding a fancy pearl-handled revolver. One of Shaw's men was on his feet again, his rifle pointed at the front door where Clara now stood with her shotgun. "You shoot me," Shaw said softly, "and my man kills the widow. Then her family. Everyone in that house will die." "Clara, get back inside," Wyatt yelled. "I am not leaving you." "Listen to him, Mrs. Whitmore," Shaw said with a terrible smile. "This is between us now." "The hell it is," she said, and raised the shotgun. "Clara, do not!" The blast was deafening, but she had not aimed at Shaw, she had aimed at his man. At that range, the shot was devastating. The rifleman went down hard. As Shaw turned toward the sound, Wyatt made his move. He knocked the pistol away and drove his fist into Shaw's gut. The man folded over and Wyatt grabbed the revolver, pressing it to Shaw's temple. "It is over," Shaw just laughed, a horrible wheezing sound. Nothing is over, boy. This is my town. You think one night changes anything? A murder charge might. Who is dead? Nobody. Your woman's shot just took my man's arm off. He will live. He will testify against her. He grinned. You just made things much worse. Wyatt looked at Clara on the porch, her face pale in the moonlight. Her brother Daniel and the cook Maggie stood behind her, ready to fight. They were terrified, but they stood together like family. Let me tell you something, Shaw, Wyatt said, pressing the barrel harder. I spent 5 years in the Union Army. I have seen things that would make you go gray overnight, and I have absolutely nothing left to lose. Everyone has something to lose, Shaw sneered. Not me. Not anymore. Wyatt's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Now, here's how this is going to go. You're going to ride on out of here and leave this good woman and her people be. If I so much as catch a whiff of you or your boys near this place again, I will finish this. No arrests, no running you out of town. I will put you in the ground. You understand me? Shaw's face went pale. He saw something in Wyatt's eyes that shook him clear to his bones. This ain't over, he stammered, but the threat was hollow. Oh, yes it is, Wyatt said, his voice quiet as a whisper. Once they were gone, his legs gave out and he dropped into the dirt. Clara was right there. You're hurt, she cried. You almost died for me. He looked up at her, the moonlight soft on her face. Some things are worth dying for. I reckon I just found one. Clara just stared, and then the tears started to fall. Wyatt, bleeding in the dust, just reached out and pulled her close. For a moment, there was just the two of them. Shaw would be back, and the law would come calling, but right then he had something to fight for again. The bleeding wouldn't quit. Clara pressed a cloth to his ribs, her hands shaking. Maggie, fetch the needle. Daniel, get some water boiling, she yelled. I'm all right, Wyatt grunted as she helped him stumble inside. He was solid muscle under his trail clothes. His arm was heavy over her shoulder. Maggie met them at the door, her face set like stone, and together they got him onto the big kitchen table. I can handle it, he tried to say, pushing himself up. You lie down or I'll put you down, Clara said, her voice leaving no room for argument. He just looked at her, a hint of a smile in his eyes, and laid back. She cut his shirt away, revealing a road map of old fights. A puckered bullet scar here, a long knife wound there, and burns on his arm. The new one was a deep graze along his ribs. You've taken a bullet before, she said, stating the obvious. What kind of life have you led, Wyatt Brennan? He winced. The kind that teaches a man to duck. Maggie came back with whiskey and poured it right on the wound. Wyatt hissed but didn't make a sound. Hold him, Maggie told Clara. This'll sting. Clara put her hands on his shoulders. He looked up at her and said, You don't have to watch this. She shook her head. I'm not going anywhere. The needle went in, and his jaw set tight as a drum. His hands gripped the table until his knuckles were white. Maggie stitched him up, murmuring, You're a tough one, I'll give you that. He almost smiled. Heard that a time or two. Clara let out a small laugh that surprised even her. Maggie tied off the last thread. He'll live. Needs rest and clean bandages. No heroics. Then she shooed Daniel out, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet kitchen. Thank you, Clara said softly. Why'd you stay? She asked after a moment. You could have just ridden on. Wasn't looking for easy, he said, his gaze steady on her. I thought I wanted peace, a place to be forgotten. Now I'm laying here thinking only about if you'll be safe come morning. Her breath hitched. Wyatt. He reached out and took her hand, his own calloused and warm. When I saw that man with his hands on you, something inside me that I thought was long dead woke up again. What was it? She whispered. Purpose, he said simply. She looked at their hands together. She should be scared, but she wasn't. My husband, James, died 2 years ago. He was a good, kind man. When he passed, I thought my heart was buried right alongside him. She met his gaze. But when you stood up for me today, I felt it beat again. His grip tightened just a little. I'm not asking for anything, Clara. But if you'll have me, I'd like to stay a while. You need help with Shaw. And I need a reason to quit running. That's not love, she said, her voice barely there. No, he agreed. But it could be a start, if we let it. She had been alone and scared for 2 long years. This was different. Stay, she whispered. We'll figure out the rest as we go. A small smile touched his lips. Yes, ma'am. Dawn broke sooner than they wanted. Clara woke in her chair to the sound of horses. Wyatt was already on his feet, his hand resting on his pistol. How many? She asked, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. 3 or 4. Looks like the sheriff. Her stomach sank. She knew this was coming. Straightening her dress, she tried to look like a respectable widow. Let me handle this, she said, walking to the door. Sheriff Tom Decker sat on his horse, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Morning, Clara, the sheriff said, his voice tired. Heard y'all had some trouble last night. You heard right, Tom. He shifted in his saddle, avoiding her eyes. Well, Mr. Shaw paid me a visit. Said you and some drifter jumped his men, shot one of them pretty bad. Is that what he told you? She said, her voice sharp as glass. Decker glanced past her at Wyatt in the doorway. I'm going to need to have a word with your friend there. His name is Wyatt Brennan, and he's my guest. Guest or not, Shaw's accusing him of assault. I need him to come with me. Wyatt stepped out onto the porch. I'll go with you, Sheriff. No need for any more trouble. This man is not the problem, Clara insisted. Shaw's men came here with torches, Tom. They were fixing to burn us out. You can see the bullet holes in my door and the blood on my porch. Is that what honest men do? The sheriff just looked away. I'm just doing my job, Clara. Your job is to protect folks, or did you forget that? You forget. You forgot that when you started taking Shaw's money. The sheriff's face turned beet red. That is a serious thing to say. It is the truth, and this whole town knows it. Sheriff Decker's hand went to his gun, but a new voice cut through the air. Tom Decker, what in heaven's name are you doing? Reverend Jacob Hartley marched down the street, his black coat flapping. His face was like a thundercloud. Reverend Decker stammered, This is not your business. Everything in this town is my business. I heard shots. Now I see you arresting the folks who were attacked. Shaw says, I do not care what Shaw says. Hartley stopped right in front of him. I have known Clara Whitmore her whole life. I will be damned if I let you drag her into Shaw's dirty dealings. This is the law, Reverend. This is not law. This is cowardice wearing a badge. Hartley pointed at Wyatt. That man defended a widow from armed thugs. If that is a crime, you had better arrest me, too. Decker looked from the Reverend to Clara, his confidence failing him. He was caught between Shaw's money and the town's conscience. I am just supposed to bring him in, he said, his voice weak. Then question him right here in front of us all. Shaw will not like that. Shaw can go to hell, the Reverend said. The words stunned everyone into silence. After a long moment, Decker's shoulders slumped. Fine, he muttered. We will do it here. He turned to Wyatt. But this is not over. Tell me what happened. Wyatt told him everything in a flat, calm voice. When he was done, Decker was pale. Check Shaw's man, Wyatt said. The one Mrs. Whitmore shot. You will find shotgun pellets in his arm. That is called self-defense. Shaw is a liar, Clara said, stepping forward. And you know it, Tom. You have known for years. Decker flinched. What is it going to be, Sheriff? Reverend Hartley asked. Are you Shaw's puppet, or are you the law? The silence was heavy. Finally, Decker took a deep breath. He turned away from Wyatt and walked right up to Shaw. He pulled out his handcuffs. Shaw, you are under arrest. I can't rightly arrest a man for defending a widow, the sheriff said, breaking the silence. He gave Wyatt a long, hard look. Not on Shaw's word alone. He then turned his attention to Wyatt. But you best understand something, son. Shaw ain't gonna let this go. He's got powerful friends and deep pockets. He will find another way to come after you. Wyatt just nodded. Let him try. The sheriff shook his head. You don't know the man you're dealing with. A quiet understanding passed between them, a silent warning. Then Sheriff Decker swung back onto his horse. I'll tell Shaw there's not enough evidence. That might buy you a day, maybe two if you're lucky. He pulled on the reins. After that, you're on your own. He rode off, his deputies following close behind, never once looking back. Clara finally let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her knees felt like jelly, and she gripped the porch railing just to stay upright. Thank you, Reverend, she managed to say. Don't be thanking me yet, Hartley said, climbing the steps to join her. Tom bought you some time, is all. Shaw won't stop. He looked her square in the eye. You need a real plan. You're a widow with a failing business and a wounded stranger as your only help. Shaw has money men and the patience of a devil. Then what do you suggest? Hartley glanced at Wyatt, then back to her. How well do you know this man? Well enough to trust him with my life. He's already saved it twice, she added. The Reverend nodded, slow and deliberate. Then maybe it's time you considered something drastic, like marriage. Clara felt the color drain from her face. Reverend? Hartley held up a hand. Hear me out. A widow is vulnerable, easy to push around. But a married woman, well, that changes things. Her property becomes her husband's. Her troubles become his troubles. All of a sudden, Shaw ain't just fighting a lone woman. He's fighting a family. But I barely know him. You knew James for 3 years, and that couldn't protect you from what happened, he said gently. The truth in his words stung. James had been a good man, but goodness hadn't been enough. I'm not saying you have to love him, Hartley went on. I'm saying you have to survive. And right now, survival might mean doing something strange. You're a preacher. You're supposed to tell me to pray. I am telling you to trust in God, he said with a grim smile. I'm also saying God helps those who help themselves. I've been a minister for 40 years, Clara. Sometimes the Lord's plan looks a whole lot like a shotgun wedding. Clara looked over at Wyatt, who had been quiet this whole time. He met her gaze, his eyes steady. What do you think? She asked him. I think the Reverend is right about one thing, Wyatt said. Shaw will not stop until he gets what he wants. And getting married would change that? It might, Wyatt admitted. At the very least, it would make things a lot harder for him. He paused. But let's be clear, Clara. This would be an arrangement, a partnership. I am not asking for your love. What are you asking for, then? I'm asking you to let me help you fight. Clara thought about the last 2 lonely, fearful years. She thought about the constant struggle just to keep her head above water. She thought about this stranger who had walked into her life and already bled for her. If I said yes, she said slowly, what would that really mean? It would mean we're partners. Your debts become my debts. Your fights become my fights. Wyatt's jaw tightened. As for anything else, that would be up to you. You'd have your own room. This is not about that. Then what is it about? Survival, he said simply. Yours, your brother's, Maggie's, and maybe a chance for us both to stop running. Clara turned back to Reverend Hartley. Could you marry us today? The old man's eyebrows shot up. Today? If Shaw is going to make another move, I want to be ready. I want him to know that I am not alone anymore. Hartley studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. I can have the papers ready by noon. You'll need witnesses. Maggie and Daniel will be enough. The Reverend then looked to Wyatt. Son, you understand what you're agreeing to. Marriage is not something you can just set aside when it gets hard. I understand. And you're sure this is what you want? Wyatt glanced at Clara, and a silent promise passed between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was a start. I'm sure. All right then, Hartley sighed. I will see you both at the church at noon. Don't you be late. He turned and walked away, leaving them alone on the porch. The silence was heavy with the decision they had just made. You don't have to go through with this, Wyatt said quietly. There might be other ways. Can you name one? He couldn't. That's what I thought, she said, wrapping her arms around herself. I have been fighting by myself for so long. Maybe it is time I tried something different. Different isn't always better. No, she agreed. But it is not always worse either. She looked up at him. Ask me again? Ask you what? If I trust you. Wyatt searched her face. Do you trust me, Clara? I do not know, she answered honestly, but I want to. And right now, that is the best I have to offer. It is enough. He held out his hand, and after a moment she took it. The morning flew by in a flurry. Maggie pressed Clara's only nice dress, a blue cotton one, all while grumbling about hasty weddings and stubborn women. Daniel cleaned his rifle, his silence saying more than words ever could. And Wyatt sat at the kitchen table while Maggie changed his bandages, his presence a quiet comfort. Clara went over the boarding house books, and the situation was just as she feared. It was bad. Very bad. Shaw had been choking her business for months. Suppliers suddenly refused her credit. Debts had tripled for no reason. $400. That was what she owed the bank, an impossible amount. How much do you have? She asked Wyatt. About $300. Is that everything you have? I do not need much. You would give it all to pay my debts? He met her eyes. I would give you more than that if I had it. It is still not enough, she whispered. We'd be short $100. Then we find $100, he said. We have 3 weeks. The church bell rang right at noon. Clara stood in the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs. Maggie came over to fix her collar. You look beautiful. I feel terrified. Sometimes that's the same thing. Daniel appeared, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best. They're ready for you. They? Who's they? Word got out, he said. There's about 20 or 30 folks in there, half the town. The other half is too scared of Shaw to show their face, Maggie added. Clara took a deep breath. This was it. She walked down the long aisle, her head held high. Wyatt was waiting for her at the altar. He was still pale, but his eyes were steady. Clara stood at the altar, marrying a man she barely knew. It was a desperate move to save her home from a ruthless man who thought he could own her. This is a story about how a little courage can change everything, so stay with us. Wyatt Brennan, her soon-to-be husband, looked cleaned up. He was tense, though. She could see it in his jaw. He was just as scared as she was, and that helped somehow. Reverend Hartley began. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. The words felt distant, like a dream. She was actually doing this. She was marrying a complete stranger. What would her late husband, James, have thought? Do you, Wyatt Thomas Brennan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Wyatt's voice was firm. I do. The Reverend turned to her. And do you, Clara Jane Whitmore, take this man to be your husband? Just as she opened her mouth to speak, the church doors burst open. It was Marcus Shaw, with 2 of his hired hands, his face red with fury. This wedding is a sham, he roared. The room exploded with noise. As people started shouting, Wyatt pulled Clara behind him protectively. Get out, Reverend Hartley commanded. This is a house of the Lord. Shaw paid him no mind, his boots thudding down the aisle. This is my town, and I won't let some drifter take what belongs to me. Clara stepped out from behind Wyatt. I don't belong to you. I never did. Your property is my property. Your debt is mine, Shaw sneered. And when this fake marriage is cancelled, you will be left with nothing. On what grounds? Wyatt asked. Shaw smiled an ugly smile. Fraud. The bride is clearly not in her right mind marrying a man she just met. Any judge will see it that way. Wyatt stepped forward. The lady said no. Now it is time for you to leave. Or what? Shaw scoffed. You'll shoot me in front of all these people? I don't have to, Wyatt said, his voice calm. Fellas like you always bring about their own downfall. The only question is who you hurt along the way. Shaw looked surprised, maybe even a little doubtful. You don't know a thing about me. I know enough, Wyatt replied. I know you built your little empire by walking all over good people, and I know you're scared that it is all about to fall apart. I am not scared of anything. Then why are you here? Wyatt asked. Why make such a scene? A confident man would have used the law. But you could not wait, because you are desperate. The color drained from Shaw's face. This is not over, he said. But the threat was gone from his voice. Oh, yes it is, Wyatt said, turning back to Clara. Reverend, I believe my bride has an answer for you. Reverend Hartley nodded. Clara Jane Whitmore, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Clara looked at Wyatt, at his steady gaze and his quiet strength. I do, she said, her voice clear. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife, the Reverend announced. You may kiss the bride. Wyatt looked uncertain, but Clara was not. She pulled him down by his shirt and kissed him. It was not a long kiss, but it was real. When she looked again, Shaw was gone and everyone was cheering. A feeling like hope started to grow inside her chest. Well, Wyatt said, a bit stunned. That was a surprise. Get used to it, Clara replied, smoothing his shirt. I am full of them. They walked out of the church as husband and wife into the bright Texas sun. Folks gathered around to offer congratulations, but Clara hardly noticed. She just felt the weight of Wyatt's hand in hers, knowing her life had changed forever. Their first night was awkward. They returned to the boarding house where Maggie had cooked them a fine meal of roast chicken and fresh bread. You did not have to do all this, Clara told her. Of course I did. It is your wedding day, Maggie said with a knowing look. They ate in a heavy silence, just the two of them at the long table. Finally, Clara spoke. This morning, when you told Shaw you knew his secrets, was that true? Mostly a bluff, Wyatt admitted. But men like him always have secrets. Clara sighed. I keep waiting to wake up and find everything is back to the way it was. Would you want that? He asked. Normal was lonely, she said. Normal was losing everything. This is frightening. But for the first time in 2 years, I feel alive. Wyatt put his fork down. Can I ask you about your husband, James? What happened? Clara's throat felt tight. She had not spoken of it to anyone but Maggie. It was an accident, she said, the words coming out in a rush. A beam fell while he was helping a neighbor raise a barn. They said it was quick. I am sorry, Wyatt said gently. Everyone is sorry, she replied. But sorry does not pay the bills or stop men like Shaw. She looked at him. What about you? You mentioned a fiancée. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Her name was Sarah, he said finally. We grew up together back in Kentucky. We planned to marry after the war. The war? I was a scout for the Union Army, he said, his jaw tight. I was good at my job, Clara. Too good. When I came home, I was not the same man she remembered. "But you went back to her," Clara said softly. "I tried, but I was haunted. Then cholera hit our town. Sarah caught it. She was gone in less than a week." "Oh, Wyatt." "I blamed myself," he confessed. "If I had been stronger, maybe I could have saved her. Grief is not fair." He met her eyes, his own filled with 6 years of pain. "That is why I understand," he told her. "I know what it feels like to lose someone, and wonder if you will ever be whole again." Clara reached across the table and took his hand. "Maybe that is why we found each other," she whispered. "Two broken people just trying to hold on." It was not love, not yet. But sitting there holding hands, it felt like something. And for now, that was enough. 3 quiet days passed. The silence from Shaw was the most unsettling part. "He is planning something," Clara said to Wyatt on the 4th morning. "Probably," Wyatt agreed, sipping his coffee. "Worrying will not change a thing. We need to focus on what we can control, like the business." "With what money?" she asked. "We are still $100 short." "I've been thinking about that," Wyatt said, a new idea sparking in his eyes. "There is a cattle drive coming through next week," he said later that evening. 500 head moving north. They will need supplies and a place to sleep. "We do not have horses to sell," Clara pointed out. "No, but we have rooms. And we have Maggie's cooking," Wyatt countered. "What if we offer meals and beds to the drovers? They pay good money." It was a solid idea, but there was a problem. We would need supplies we cannot afford. Shaw has made sure no one in town will give us credit. "No one in this town," Wyatt corrected her. "But what about the next one over?" Maggie turned from the stove. "He has a point. Shaw's reach ends at the county line. My cousin runs a store in Miller's Creek. He owes me a favor." "You would do that?" Clara asked, surprised. "Child, I have been watching you fight alone for 2 years. It is about time someone helped." Maggie pointed her spoon at Wyatt. "You take the wagon to Miller's Creek today. I will write a list. Clara, you get the rooms ready. You get the down." "That is a full day's ride each way," Clara protested. "Then he had better get moving," Maggie said. Wyatt was already on his feet looking at Clara. "This is a good plan. Let me do this." She wanted to tell him no, to keep him close and safe, but she swallowed her fear. "Be careful," she said instead. It felt like a lifetime of being treated unfairly, and it was about to get a whole lot worse. If you have ever been the underdog, pushed into a corner by somebody with more power than sense, then you know exactly how Clara felt. This is the story of how she fought back, and it is a reminder that you have to make a little trouble to find your peace. The troubles started not an hour after her husband Wyatt left town. Clara was hanging laundry when the bank manager, Mr. Harrison, showed up, sweating more than a sinner in church. He twisted his hat in his hands and could not quite meet her eyes. He was there about the loan. He said the bank, meaning that snake Marcus Shaw, was calling in the entire amount. Right now. Clara's heart went cold. Immediately? They had 3 more weeks, but Harrison pointed to some fine print about a material change. "Her marrying Wyatt," he stammered, "was that change. The bank had every right. She had 3 days. 3 days to find $400, or they would be thrown off the land her father had built, the land her first husband had died for." After the banker scurried away, Daniel, her farmhand, found her staring at the notice. He asked what they were going to do. Clara's voice was steady as stone. "I am not running. This is our home. I am going to fight." That night, sleep was a distant dream. Wyatt's savings gave them $300. The strongbox held $50. They were still $50 short. Just after midnight, she heard footsteps on the porch. Clara grabbed the pistol Wyatt had left her and crept to the window. A tall figure stood in the shadows. The knock was soft, almost nervous. She moved to the door, the cold steel of the gun a comfort in her hand. "Who is out there?" A young man's voice answered, shaky and urgent. "Mrs. Brennan, I have to talk to you. It is about Shaw." She opened the door just a crack. The man on her porch was young, dressed in clothes that cost more than her whole farm, and he looked terrified. "My name is Samuel Shaw," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Marcus Shaw is my uncle." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "Give me one good reason I should not shoot you right now." "Because," he said, "I can help you destroy him." Inside, at the kitchen table, Samuel laid out the whole ugly story. His uncle was a cheat and a thief, and he had the proof. He slid a folded document across the table. It was a copy of his uncle's private ledger, showing years of cooked books and bribery, enough to put him behind bars for good. Clara did not touch the paper. "Why me?" "Because he is going to kill me," Samuel admitted, his composure finally breaking. "He knows I have been asking questions. You are the only one in this whole town who is not afraid of him." Samuel was not looking for a friend. He was looking for protection. He could not stop the foreclosure. That was already in motion. But if she could just hold on for 3 days, he would testify. He would give the ledger to the law and burn his uncle's empire to the ground. Clara looked at the scared young man offering to betray his own family to save his skin. It was a desperate gamble. "All right," she said, "you can stay. But nobody can know you are here." Morning brought a hard pounding on the front door. It was Sheriff Decker, his face like a thundercloud. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, not wasting any time. "There was an incident out on the Millers Creek Road." Clara's blood ran cold. "Wyatt?" "He is alive," Decker said, his voice flat. "Barely. Somebody ambushed his wagon last night, shot him twice, and left him for dead." The world spun around her. "Where is he?" "Doc Patterson's. He is asking for you." She turned to her housekeeper, Maggie, her voice a fierce whisper. "Samuel stays hidden. No one sees him." Then she ran, her feet pounding the dirt road all the way to Main Street, her heart hammering in her chest. Her side. "Where is he?" she asked. Old Doc Patterson, a man with kind eyes, gestured to the back. "He's in there, Mrs. Brennan, but you ought to know." She didn't wait to find out what. Pushing past the curtain, she saw Wyatt on the table, his chest a mess of bloody bandages. He was pale as a sheet, his breathing was shallow, and one eye was swollen shut. But he was breathing. "Clara," he rasped, his voice barely there. She rushed to his side, grabbing his hand. "I'm here, Wyatt. Don't you try to talk." "Have to," he coughed, a fleck of blood on his lips. "It was Shaw's man, the one you shot." His voice was low and urgent. "Said this was a message. Said next time they won't miss." Tears fell down Clara's face, but her voice was as steady as a rock. "There won't be a next time. I'm going to kill him, Wyatt. I'm fixin' to kill Marcus Shaw." "No," he said, his grip surprisingly strong. "That's his game. You kill him, you hang. He wins that way." "Then what am I supposed to do? Just let him take everything from us?" "You're supposed to ruin him," Wyatt whispered. "Ruin him proper by the book. Make him wish he'd never laid eyes on you. How?" "You're smart, Clara. You'll figure it out." He coughed again, harder this time. "The money for the supplies. The wagon is gone. Everything." A single word escaped his lips. "Damn." His eyes fluttered shut. "Then we're out of time. 3 days left and $50 short." His voice was a faint whisper. "I'm sorry. I promised I'd protect you." Clara leaned down close. "You came back to me. That's all that matters right now. You rest. I'll handle this." "That's what I'm afraid of," he said, a ghost of a smile on his face. She stayed until he was sound asleep, her mind churning. 3 days, $50, a wounded husband, and Marcus Shaw circling overhead. The odds were long, but Clara Brennan wasn't one to back down from a fight. She found Samuel in the back room, pacing like a trapped coyote. "I heard about your husband," he said. "He'll make it," she answered, closing the door. "But Shaw is getting desperate. He's not waiting for the foreclosure. He wants us gone now." "So what do we do?" Clara laid the ledger on the table. "We use this. Tonight. But we don't have a plan. Then we're making one right now, she declared. Show me every crooked deal, every bribe. We're going to find the one thing he can't talk his way out of. They worked all through the night. By sunrise, Clara found it. 3 years ago, Shaw had bought a deed from the county recorder. The price on the books was $200. But the ledger showed he'd really paid $2,000. The extra money went straight into the recorder's pocket as a bribe. The land itself was a worthless little plot, except for one thing. It sat right on top of the only underground spring in the whole county. Shaw knew about the water, bribed the official to keep it quiet, and then bought up all the surrounding land for next to nothing. He'd poisoned the other wells, making the drought seem worse, forcing folks to sell for pennies. It was theft on a grand scale. This is it, Clara said. This is how we bury him. Who do we take it to? Samuel asked. The sheriff and the judge are in his pocket. Not everyone, Clara said, her tiredness gone. There's a federal marshal down in Austin who handles land fraud. Austin is a 3-day ride, he pointed out. I know, Clara said, looking straight at him. That's why you're going. You're his nephew. He won't be watching you. Take the fastest horse we have and ride day and night. Get this to the marshal before that deadline. What about you? I'll keep Shaw busy. Make him think the ledger is still right here and buy you some time. He'll kill you. A cold smile touched her lips. He's been trying for 2 years now. Hasn't managed it yet. Samuel just stared at her. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the craziest. Probably a little of both, she said, pushing the ledger into his hands. Now go. He left, and Clara stood alone in the quiet room. 2 days left, a husband laid up, no money and no help. She was on her own against the most powerful man in the county. She'd never faced odds this bad before. But surrendering just wasn't in her blood. Sometime in the last week, she'd stopped fighting just to survive. Now, she was fighting to win. The knock on her door came around noon. She'd been expecting it. She opened it and found Marcus Shaw on her porch. He looked older than she remembered and tired. Mrs. Brennan, he said, tipping his hat. May I come inside? No. Fine, he said, his hands behind his back. I hear you've been talking with my nephew. Gotten your hands on some interesting documents. Clara's heart pounded, but her face was a mask. I don't know what you're talking about. Shaw's smile was cold as ice. Samuel came to see you 2 nights ago. Gave you a ledger, I believe, full of my business dealings. Your nephew hasn't been here. Lying ain't a good look for you, Mrs. Brennan, Shaw said, stepping closer. I know everything that goes on in this town. Did you honestly think I wouldn't find out? If you knew, why didn't you stop him? Because I wanted to see what you'd do. Shaw's voice dropped low. Sending Samuel to Austin. That was a bold move. Desperate, but bold. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. You're bluffing. Am I? He's about 50 miles out by now. My men ought to be catching up to him any minute. If you hurt him. He's my family. Shaw cut her off, shaking his head. I'm not going to hurt him. I'm going to bring him home. And when he gets back, he's going to tell everyone that ledger was a fake. A forgery you created to frame me. No one will believe him. Oh, they'll believe him. Shaw leaned in close. Because he won't have a choice. Family is about loyalty, Mrs. Brennan. Samuel's about to get a hard lesson in that. Clara wanted to shoot him right there on the porch, but she heard Wyatt's voice in her head. That's what he wants. What do you want, Shaw? Same thing I've always wanted. Your property. Sign the deed, and we can end this whole ugly business. And if I say no? Shaw stepped back. Well, then things might get ugly. Your husband already had one little accident. Your brother walks to school all by himself. And that cook of yours, Maggie, she's getting on in years. Accidents happen. Something inside Clara snapped. It wasn't her spirit. That was burning hotter than a branding iron. It was the last little bit of hope that this could end without more blood being spilled. "You'll never stop," she said, her voice quiet. "Even if I give you everything, you'll just keep coming." "You will still be breathing," Shaw said with a cold smile. "Now get off my land. You have 2 days, Mrs. Brennan." As he left, Clara's hands trembled with a helpless rage. 2 days. Everything she had gambled was gone, but quitting was not in her blood. She just needed a new plan. Back at the doctor's office, Wyatt was sitting up. He looked pale as a ghost, but his eyes were sharp. "You look like you have been rode hard and put away wet," he managed. Clara sighed, sinking into a chair. "Takes one to know one. Shaw knows everything, Wyatt. He has the ledger and his men are after Samuel." Wyatt cursed under his breath. "I am at the end of my rope," she admitted. "I have tried it all, but he is just too powerful." "So you are folding?" he asked. "Never," she shot back. "But I will fight until I'm in the ground, and he will still win." Wyatt slowly took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "There is one card you have not played yet," he said. "The truth." Clara looked puzzled. "What do you mean? Shaw's power comes..." "Shaw's power is built on fear," Wyatt explained. "Everyone in this town is too scared to cross him. But what if they were not? What if you stood up and told everyone out loud exactly what he is? They would not listen. They would be terrified." "Some would," Wyatt insisted, his voice gaining strength. "But others are just waiting for a leader. You have the truth, Clara. The poisoned water, the bribes, the violence. Folks know. They just need someone with the guts to say it." "And then his men come for me," she countered. "Maybe," he conceded. "Or maybe a whole town standing together is more powerful than a few hired guns." The idea was terrifying. It was reckless. And it was all she had left. "The town meeting is tomorrow night," she said, the plan forming in her mind. "At the church." A painful smile touched Wyatt's lips. "Perfect. He will be there. You can look him square in the eye while you tear his kingdom down." The thought of accusing Marcus Shaw in front of her neighbors was almost paralyzing. But then she thought of her late husband, James, her father, and all the others Shaw had ruined. "All right," she declared. "Tomorrow night it is." "You are sure about this?" Wyatt asked. "Not one bit," Clara admitted, squeezing his hand. "But I'm doing it anyway. That is my girl." She looked at this man who had sacrificed so much for her. "Wyatt," she began softly, "if we get through this, I think I'm falling for you." He smiled, a genuine warm smile. "Might be," he chuckled. "Let us get through this first, then we can sort out the rest." "Deal." A gentle kiss sealed their promise, sparking a feeling of hope. The next evening, the church was packed. Clara watched the worn-out faces of her neighbors file in. Farmers, merchants, families, they all came, and tonight she had something to say. Wyatt, pale and in pain, sat beside her against the doctor's wishes. "I have to do this," she whispered. He just squeezed her hand and said, "Then so do I." Marcus Shaw strolled in last with his hired muscle, taking his seat up front like a king on a throne. Reverend Hartley cleared his throat. "Good evening. Before we start, Mrs. Brennan has asked to speak." A low murmur went through the room. Shaw turned, a smirk on his face as his eyes found Clara. "The floor is yours," the Reverend said. Clara's legs felt weak as she walked that long aisle, every soul in the church watching her. She took her place at the pulpit. "You all know me," she started, her voice surprisingly firm. "I am Clara Brennan. My family has been here for generations. And for the past year, Marcus Shaw has been trying to take everything from me." The murmurs turned to gasps, but Shaw's smug smile never faded. "He has threatened me, poisoned my well, and tried to ruin my business," Clara's voice rang out. "3 days ago, his men shot my husband and left him on the road to die." "That is a lie," one of Shaw's men yelled, jumping up. "Sit down, Billy," Shaw said calmly. "Let her finish." Clara locked eyes with Shaw. I know you are all afraid of him. I was too, but I'm not afraid anymore. Shaw stood up, feigning concern. Mrs. Brennan, these are awful things to say. Do you have any proof? I have my husband, the doctor who treated him, and my brother, she said. Hardly impartial witnesses, Shaw scoffed. Your word is not enough. Then how about mine? A voice called from the back. The whole church turned. There stood Samuel, bruised and bloody, but alive. Next to him was a federal marshal, his badge shining in the lamplight. As Samuel walked toward the front, Clara finally saw real fear on Marcus Shaw's face. Samuel, he stammered. Your men failed, Samuel said, holding up a document, but he handed the papers to the marshal. Marcus Shaw, the lawman's voice boomed in the silent church. I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. This is ridiculous, Shaw sputtered, his calm facade shattering. This document is fake. It has been verified in Austin, the marshal said, pulling out handcuffs. As Shaw's men went for their guns, Wyatt's voice cut through the air. I would not. He was on his feet, his pistol steady despite his injuries. Think it over. The hired guns backed down. As the marshal cuffed him, Shaw's true colors showed. You will all regret this. I built this town, he snarled. Without you, Clara said softly, this town can finally be free. The marshal cuffed Shaw's hands behind his back. Shaw paused beside her on his way out. This is not over, he hissed. I have lawyers. I will be out within a week. And when I am. And when you are, Clara replied, meeting his hateful stare, I will be waiting. But I am not afraid of you anymore. She turned to the crowd. None of us are. A lone clap started from the back, then another, until the whole church was filled with applause, drowning out Shaw's empty threats as he was led away. In that moment, surrounded by her neighbors, Clara cried tears of relief. The town was finally free. Afterwards, people swarmed her with thanks. She saw Sheriff Decker hanging back, looking ashamed. You can be stronger now, she told him gently. Help the marshal. Be the lawman this town needs. The sheriff stood a little taller. Yes, ma'am, he said with newfound resolve. I will. Wyatt was waiting outside the church, leaning on the wall. He looked pale, but he was smiling. You did it. No, Clara said, slipping under his arm to help him stand. We did it. All of us. You know what this means, don't you? He asked. That we get to keep the boarding house. That too, he said, his eyes softening. But when all this started, you married me for protection. A business deal. I remember, she said. And now? He asked, cupping her face in his hand. Now that Shaw is gone and you don't need protecting anymore, what happens to us? Clara thought about the man who had come into her life like a Texas whirlwind and somehow become her calm center. I think, she said, I'd like to find out who we are when we're not fighting for our lives. Sounds like a fine plan. Later, Samuel found them at the boarding house, all bandaged up by Doc Patterson. His eyes were clear, clearer than she'd ever seen them. I wanted to thank you, he said, for believing in me and for giving me the chance to do the right thing. You're the one who took all the risks, Clara told him. You rode to Austin, got yourself caught. Samuel explained how he had escaped. My uncle's men figured I was just a soft city boy, he said with a grim smile. They forgot that even a cornered rabbit will bite. He was heading for California to start a life where the Shaw name could not follow him. Clara offered him a place to stay, to help them rebuild the town. He thanked her, but said he needed to find himself first. You will always have a home here, she promised as he walked out into the night. Wyatt put his arm around her. He will be all right. We still owe the bank $100, Clara sighed, leaning against him. Actually, Wyatt said, pulling a paper from his pocket, we do not. The marshal gave me this. With the investigation, all of Shaw's accounts have been frozen. Every crooked deal he ever made is coming apart at the seams. Everything was finally settled, even the crooked loans he had arranged. Clara looked at the official letter from the bank. The debt was gone, and the property was hers, free and clear. "It's over," she breathed. "The fight is really over." Wyatt pulled her close and said, "I'm hoping something new is just getting started." She looked up at this man, this stranger who had become her whole world. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "You could go back to drifting, find that quiet life you wanted. I found something better right here." "And what's that?" He smiled. "You. This town. This life. I came here for flour and coffee, Clara, but I found a home." He kissed her forehead. "Is that enough for you? After all you've been through?" "It's more than enough," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's everything." The town of Dusty Springs started to heal. With Shaw's dark shadow gone, folks started talking and trading freely again, making plans without fear. The boarding house was soon full of guests, just like Wyatt said it would be. Maggie cooked up huge meals, pretending to be put out by all the work. Daniel shot up 3 inches tall and started talking about becoming a lawman himself. Reverend Hartley gave sermons on courage and how ordinary people can change their own lives. And Clara and Wyatt, they learned how to be truly married. It wasn't always a cakewalk. They'd bicker about money, or whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Sometimes, Wyatt's nightmares from the war would wake them both. And Clara still had days where she'd cry thinking of James. But they talked it all through, building something together that was stronger than anything they could have built alone. One evening, about 3 months after Shaw was gone, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "I've been thinking," Wyatt said. She gave him a little poke. "A dangerous habit." He ignored her. "This place is doing well. We've got more business than we can rightly handle. Are you complaining?" "Just making an observation." He turned to her. "We could expand, build some cottages out back for folks staying a while. Maybe even start a small ranch. That's a big dream. I've got ambitious partners." "Partners? As in more than one?" "You, me, Maggie, and Daniel when he's old enough." Wyatt took her hand. "And maybe some others down the road." "Others?" He cleared his throat. "Children? If you'd want them someday." Clara's heart nearly stopped. They had never dared talk about this while they were fighting to survive. "Is that what you want?" she asked him. "I want whatever you want. But yeah, I think about it. Little ones running around, teaching them to ride, watching them grow up safe." "That sounds," she blinked back tears. "That sounds wonderful." "Yeah," he whispered, pulling her close. They sat there as the stars came out, dreaming of a future that was finally real. Sheriff Decker was true to his word. At the federal trial, he laid out every bribe and threat that Shaw had forced on him. That testimony helped put Shaw away for 20 years in a federal prison, with no chance of getting out early. Shaw's whole crooked empire fell apart. They seized his property, and the water rights he stole went back to the county. Justice had been done. Decker tried to turn in his badge, saying he wasn't fit to wear it. But Clara talked him into staying on. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she told him. "Even you." And he proved her right, earning back the town's trust one day at a time. On their first anniversary, Clara woke up to Wyatt just watching her. "That's a little creepy," she mumbled. He chuckled. "It's romantic. Happy anniversary. Did you get me a present? You'll see." He led her outside, where all their friends were gathered. "What's all this?" Behind the boarding house was a brand new building with a freshly painted sign. It read, "Brennan and Whitmore Ranch, established 1878. "We built it while you were sleeping," Wyatt said with a big grin. "No, you did not." "Well, we've been at it for months, but we put the finishing touches on last night." He wrapped his arms around her. "What do you think?" Clara just stared at the sign, at their future spread out right in front of them. "I think," she said, "this is the best anniversary present a woman could ever get. Better than flour and coffee. Much better." She turned and kissed him right there, with all their friends cheering. The cowboy who rode into town for supplies had found something so much more valuable, and they both knew they'd never let it go. 2 years made all the difference. Clara stood in the doorway of their new ranch house watching the sun rise. Behind her, Wyatt was making coffee just like he did every morning. 2 years. Sometimes it felt like a whole lifetime ago, and other times, like yesterday. "You're thinking awful loud over there," Wyatt called out. "How can you tell?" "'Cause you're just standing there instead of drinking your coffee." She smiled and went inside. He handed her a cup. "What's on your mind?" "Just remembering the day you first rode into town." "Worst decision I ever made," he teased. "Liar." She poked him. "All right, best decision. Depends on the day." He kissed the top of her head. "Today is a best decision day. And why is that? Because you're here, and Maggie's bringing over that peach pie you love later." "The peach one?" She sighed with pure happiness. This was her life. Quiet mornings and a husband who could make her laugh. After her first husband, James, died, she never thought she'd find love again. Wyatt proved her wrong. The sound of fast hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. "Expecting company?" Wyatt asked, his hand naturally moving toward his gun. "No." They stepped onto the porch just as a rider came into view. It was her brother, Daniel, and he was riding his horse way too hard. Something was terribly wrong. "Clara!" he yelled, pulling the horse to a skidding stop. "You gotta come to town, right now." "What is it, Daniel?" "It's Shaw." His face was pale. "He escaped." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut. "That's not possible. He was in federal prison." "Was. He broke out 3 days ago. Killed 2 guards doing it. The marshal sent a telegram." "He's coming this way, Clara." "They think he's coming for you." Wyatt's face turned to stone. "Both of you get inside the house. Now, we will handle this, but right now I need you safe." Clara wanted to tell him she wasn't some damsel in distress, but the worry in Wyatt's eyes was for her, not of Shaw. So she went inside the house. Daniel was right behind her, still catching his breath. Clara looked at him. "Tell me everything." Daniel paced the floor. "A wire from the marshal came this morning. Shaw had help. Someone paid off the guards and slipped him a gun. He's been loose for 3 days now." Wyatt's voice was low and steady. "He's coming here. A man like that doesn't break out of prison just to disappear. He escapes to settle old scores." "Then what are we going to do?" Clara asked. "We get ready." Wyatt sent Daniel to round up the 4 ranch hands. Meanwhile, Clara laid out every rifle and pistol they owned, her hands steady as she checked them. "We could just leave," she said quietly. "Go where?" Wyatt asked, loading shells into his shotgun. "Shaw won't ever stop hunting us." Maggie showed up before sundown, bringing food, more ammunition, and a will made of iron. "Don't you start with me," she told Clara. "This ain't just your battle. That man tried to tear my family apart, and you're my family." Clara hugged her tight. Night came on slow and heavy. They barricaded the doors and put a man at every window waiting for a fight that refused to start. The silence stretched on for hours. "Maybe he ain't coming," Daniel whispered from his post. "Oh, he's coming," Wyatt answered. "He's just waiting for us to get tired, to lower our guard." Wyatt checked his Colt revolver for what felt like the 100th time. "Men like Shaw are patient. He'll make his move when we least expect it." "Then we won't stop expecting it," Clara said, coming to stand by her husband. "I'm sorry I brought this on you." "You didn't bring nothing," Wyatt said, turning to her. "Shaw made his own choices. We made ours. And I'd make 'em all again, Clara." He gently cupped her face in his hands. "These last 2 years have been the best of my life. Nothing that happens tonight can change that. I love you." "I love you too," she whispered. He gave her a short, soft kiss. "Now let's make sure we get to keep saying it." The attack came with the dawn. The first shot blew out the front window, jerking Clara awake in her chair. "Get down!" Wyatt hollered. More bullets tore through the walls from all sides. Clara crawled to a window and peeked out, counting the flashes of gunfire. "At least 6 of them, maybe 7. Shaw found himself some friends, Wyatt growled. The gunfire got heavier, punching holes all through the house. One of the ranch hands cried out that he was hit. "We can't just stay in here and let them pick us off," Clara said. "And we can't go out there," Wyatt countered. "They have us pinned down good." "Then we change the rules," Clara said, grabbing Wyatt's arm. "The cellar. Papa built a tunnel that leads out to the creek." Wyatt stared at her. "You have a secret tunnel, and you're just now bringing it up? I didn't figure we'd ever need it." Another window shattered. Clara's voice was firm. "Get everyone to the cellar. We go together or not at all." They gathered the others and hurried down into the dark. The tunnel was tight, smelling of old earth and fear. "Go on," Wyatt urged. "I'll be right behind y'all." Clara crawled first, her rifle slung on her back. Her hands scraped against rock, but she pushed forward. After a few long minutes, she saw daylight. The tunnel opened up near the creek, hidden by a mess of thick brush. She climbed out and helped the others. Wyatt came out last, his face smeared with dirt. "Now what?" he asked. "Now we circle around," Clara said. "Hit 'em from behind while they're still shooting at an empty house." It was a crazy plan, but it was the only one they had. They moved quiet as ghosts along the creek bed, the sound of gunfire at the house covering their approach. Wyatt pointed. "There, 4 of 'em, behind that fallen log." They were all busy reloading, their eyes locked on the ranch house. "Where is Shaw?" Just then, the cold steel of a gun barrel pressed against Clara's temple. "Right here," a voice hissed in her ear. Clara went stiff. The click of hammers being pulled back echoed behind her. "Drop your guns," Shaw ordered, his voice shaky with rage. "All of you. Now!" Nobody moved a muscle. "I said drop 'em!" he shrieked, "or I'll put a bullet right through her head." "Don't do it," Clara said, her own voice calm. "Don't give him what he wants." "Shut up," Shaw yelled. "You ruined me. You took everything I built." "You did that to yourself," Clara said. "When you decided other folks' lives didn't mean a thing." "This is between me and her," Shaw snarled at Wyatt. "You were just some nobody who got in my way. I've spent 2 years in a cage thinking about this, and it ends with her." "You kill her, you're a dead man," Wyatt said, his voice flat as a West Texas prairie. "Maybe," Shaw sneered, "but I'll die knowing I took what matters most from you. How's it feel, Brennan? How's it feel to be helpless?" Clara closed her eyes, thinking of the life she and Wyatt had made. Then she stopped thinking and started fighting. She rammed her elbow back into Shaw's gut with all her might. The gun went off, the shot flying wild as he gasped for air. She spun around, a whirlwind of fury. Shaw was bigger and stronger, but Clara was faster, and she was fighting for her life. She raked her nails across his face and drove her knee hard into his groin. He screamed and dropped his pistol. As Clara kicked it away, gunfire erupted all around them as Wyatt and the others opened fire on Shaw's men. Shaw got his hands around her throat, just like he did 2 years ago. "I should have killed you then," he choked out. "But you didn't," Clara rasped, her vision starting to go dark. "You lost then, and you're going to lose now." "Not yet," he grunted, his grip tightening. She couldn't breathe. Her hands clawed at his, but it was no use. Suddenly, a single shot cracked through the air, sharp and close. Shaw's grip went slack. His eyes widened in disbelief. He looked down at the dark red stain spreading across his shirt, then back at Clara. "How?" he whispered. And then he collapsed. Daniel stood over him, holding a smoking pistol, his hands trembling. "I got him," the boy said, his voice barely audible. "I really got him." Clara gasped for air, her throat on fire. She looked down at the man who had been her nightmare for 3 long years. He was finally gone. It was finally done. She could breathe again. Wyatt was right there, pulling her close and looking her over. He asked if she was hurt, his voice tight with worry. She managed to whisper that she was all right. He held on to her so tight she could hardly draw a breath, but she just leaned into his chest, finally feeling safe. Behind them, Shaw's remaining men were dropping their guns as the ranch hands moved in. It was never a fair fight to begin with, a pack of desperate men against folks defending their own land. Your own land always wins. By midday, the marshal showed up with his deputies and doctors, bringing a mountain of paperwork with them. They loaded Shaw's body onto a wagon and hauled his men away in chains. The marshal told Clara they both did a fine thing, that Shaw had been on the wanted list for a long time. When he mentioned a reward, Clara told him to keep it. She wanted the money to help the families of the men Shaw had killed. The marshal just nodded, a look of deep respect in his eyes. He said she was one of a kind. She just told him she was tired and ready for the nightmare to be over. He promised her it was. As the wagon carrying Shaw's body pulled away, Clara watched the end of a man who caused so much pain. She felt no victory, just a quiet, bone-deep relief. "Let's go home," she said to Wyatt. "We are home," he answered gently. She clarified, "Inside. I need to sit on something soft with a strong drink and just empty my mind for a while." Wyatt smiled. "Now that sounds like a plan." A month went by and the ranch began to heal. New wood patched the bullet holes and fresh glass filled the windows. Life was getting back to the way it was before. But sometimes Clara would jolt awake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, sure she'd heard a gunshot. Wyatt was always there to hold her, murmuring that everything was all right until the fear passed. She asked him one night if that feeling, that dread, ever truly leaves. He told her it gets quieter. It never disappears, but you learn to live beside it. Daniel left for Austin at the end of the month. He was going to train as a deputy marshal, having found a new purpose in all that chaos. "I'm so proud of you," Clara told him as he stood by the stagecoach. Dad would be too. He hugged her little brother who was now a man. "You take care of yourself, Clara." He climbed aboard and didn't look back. She watched until he was just a speck of dust on the horizon. Wyatt came and stood beside her. "He'll be fine," he said. "I know," she replied. "I just miss him already." Autumn arrived, turning the valley into a painting of gold and crimson. Clara was on the porch watching the cattle in the distance. She could hear Maggie singing from the kitchen. Wyatt came up from behind and wrapped his arms around her waist. His hands rested on her belly, where a small new curve was just beginning to show. "Have you told Maggie yet?" he asked softly. She said she was waiting for the right time. He chuckled. "She's going to cry." Clara admitted that she had cried, and Wyatt confessed he had too. His arms tightened around her. "Clara, there's something I have to tell you. For 6 years I was running. From my past, from myself, from any shot at a good life. I told myself I was looking for peace, but I was really just looking for a place to hide. And then I rode into Dusty Springs. I saw a man threatening a woman, and for some reason I stopped. I just knew I couldn't let anything happen to you." He turned her so they were face to face. "That single moment changed my whole life. It changed me. You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. A reason to finally stop running. A home worth fighting for." His eyes were shining. "2 years ago, I was lost." Wyatt took her hands and looked her square in the eye. "I married you because it made sense on paper. But somewhere along this hard road, all that logic turned into something I can't quite name." "Well, try," she whispered. He took a breath. "I love you, Clara. Not because I'm supposed to, but because you are the bravest, most stubborn woman I have ever known. You make me want to be a better man. When I look ahead, you are the only thing I see." Clara raised a hand to his weathered face. "I love you too. I think I have since you carried me from that church. Or maybe it was the moment you told Shaw to back down, and he knew you meant business. That was when it all changed for me." They stood there, holding each other, as the Texas sun bled across the horizon. From inside, Maggie's voice called out, "Supper is on the table, you two. Stop all that romancing and get in here and eat." Clara chuckled. "We probably ought to go in." But neither of them moved. "Just 5 more minutes," Wyatt said, holding her tighter. 5 more minutes. And just like that, spring arrived. On a morning when wildflowers painted the whole valley, Clara gave birth to their daughter. They named her Hope, for the feeling that got them through the darkest days. Wyatt held his baby girl for the very first time, with tears running right down his face, and not an ounce of shame about it. "She is perfect," he whispered. "She is loud," Clara said, tired but grinning. "She gets that from you." "Now I do not know what you are talking about. I am a quiet man." Wyatt let out that big, free laugh she loved so much. "You are the least quiet person I have ever met, and I would not change a thing." They brought Hope home to the ranch house, a place that had seen hardship and gunfire but was now filled with a love that could stand up to anything. Time moved on, one day at a time, and they learned how to be parents the same way they learned everything else, right there together. The ranch thrived, the town of Dusty Springs grew, and their little family was whole. More children came along, 2 sons, both with their father's green eyes and their mother's unshakable will. Clara and Wyatt grew old together, just like they said they would. On the evening of their 20th anniversary, they sat on the porch, watching the stars pop out in the big night sky. "Do you remember," Clara asked softly, "the day you first rode into this town?" "Every single second of it." "What would you have said back then if someone told you this was how your life would turn out?" Wyatt gave a slow smile. "I would have told them they were plumb crazy. But now, I would say I am the luckiest man alive." He took her hand, a gesture familiar as breathing. "I came to Dusty Springs for flour and coffee. I ended up finding my whole world instead." "Any regrets?" "Not a single one," Wyatt said. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady strength that had been her anchor for so long. "Me neither," she said. "A cowboy had come to town for supplies. He found a home, he found a family, and he found a love that would last a lifetime. And that was more than enough." This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.